249 years ago yesterday, King George III of Great Britain issued a proclamation ending what has been called the real First World War. Although it took place 2.5 centuries ago, the consequences of the French and Indian War are still with us today. With more on this, we welcome on the line from Boston, Massachusetts, William Fowler. He's the author of Empires at War, The 7 Years' War, and the Struggle for North America. Professor Fowler, it's great to have you back on TVO. How are you?
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm delighted to be with you.
I want to start by just reading a small excerpt from your book to set the table for our discussion to come, and here goes. The forces of England, France, and their allies, you wrote, fought on virtually every continent. Thousands of soldiers had died in Europe, and many thousands more fell in America, Africa, and India. Never before had nations warred on such a vast scale. It was the First World War. England triumphed, and its war leaders laid at the feet of their sovereign vast new territories, nearly 20 times the size of the British Isles. A war that had begun accidentally and without a plan ended with grand consequences. That's in a way the end of the story, but I want to take us back to the beginning of the story now and set the scene in North America. The United States and Canada, as countries, don't really exist yet. So what's here back in the day?
Well, certainly back before the war began, there was this vast continent called North America, about which Europeans knew very little beyond the Appalachian Mountains and certain parts of the Great Lakes. A nation, or not a nation, but a continent that over time the French had taken their position in the northern area, beginning with Jacques Cartier and Champlain, and farther south along the eastern seaboard gradually over the period of about 100 years, British colonies had been established. So that by the mid-part of the 18th century, there were two well-established empires here in North America. British North America, composed of these 13 colonies, really hugging the Atlantic seashore, and then to their north, French Canada, primarily confined to the valley of the St. Lawrence, where the major population centers were, but of course extending far into the interior because of the relations with the Native Americans and the fur trading enterprise.
And how important was it to the French at that time to hang on to what they had in, I guess, what would be present-day Canada?
That's a very good question, Steve. There's a quote from Voltaire, who once remarked about Canada, "What is it but a few acres of snow?" And at the time, as far as the French Empire went, from an economic point of view, Canada was probably of marginal importance. It did have the fur trade, but the islands in the West Indies and the possessions in India were, from an economic point of view, far more valuable than Canada was. And nonetheless, France held on to Canada for strategic and military purposes. But if one had to do an accounting, a financial accounting, Canada would not have shown up as a great prize. And that reveals itself, too, in the course of the great struggle between France and Great Britain in the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War, inasmuch as the main focus for the French is in Europe, not on Canada. They don't invest greatly in a military or naval sense in trying to hold on to Canada, realizing the difficulty of it and realizing that perhaps it's not worth a great investment of their time, money, and soldiers.
Having said that, what was the actual spark that lit the fuse that led to this war?
Well, it was, of course, that rambunctious, that young, colonel from the Virginia militia named George Washington. The spark that set this was a land dispute. The French claimed land west of the Alleghenies. Keep in mind the geography here, that French Canada and then French Louisiana were connected by a river and lake system. And so the French claimed the land in the west through the Ohio Valley in that region. And the people of Pennsylvania, and particularly Virginia, also claimed that land. The royal governor of Virginia, a man named Robert Dinwiddie, dispatched young Washington west to warn the French out of what the French had just established a fort at the junction of the Monongahela and Allegheny rivers at a place they called Fort Duquesne. And so Washington had been dispatched then to send the French away. In the course of his expedition to the west and a variety of rather complex things that happened, Washington and the Virginia militia attacked, and I do mean this, attacked without provocation, a French party, ambushed them, as the French would say, killed several French soldiers. And that was the spark that set this world ablaze. That was in 1754. It actually takes 2 more years for the war to be officially declared in Europe. Hence the difference, by the way, between the European and American point of view. We call it the French and Indian War. In Europe, they often call it the 7 Years' War, even though it started in 1754, and you can do the arithmetic for that. But it was Washington and the Virginia militia that provoked the French. It's not to say that the war might not have started in any case. The tinder was piled pretty high. It only took a spark. Washington struck that spark.
There were, of course, significant Indian tribes of the day that got involved in this war as well. And how did they divvy up sides, as it were?
For the most part, the Native Americans tended to favor the French, which certainly made all the sense for them. The French population was small, and the French culture and economic enterprise, fur trading, was quite compatible with Native American interests. The French did not seek to seize, hold, farm, settle, develop the West. They were quite content to exploit it in conjunction with the Native Americans. The British, on the other hand, were quite different. The British were settlers, farmers. It was often said that there were 2 things that the English settlers hated. They hated trees and they hated Native Americans. And they wanted to be rid of both so that they could occupy the land. And that's a very important distinction between the French and the British. The British wanted to occupy the land. The French were not quite so interested in that. Now, the Native Americans, of course, were quite clever. They had lived with the European presence for many generations. And they often tried to play one off against the other. The British off against the French, and even in the Dutch, when they were here prior in the 17th century, using the Dutch as well. But in the long term, it was clearly the French who were more compatible with the Native Americans, and they did indeed tend to side with them throughout most of the war.
And just curious, you've got French spoken, English spoken, and of course several Native American languages. How did these different groups communicate with each other? In what language would they have done so?
Well, in a mishmash, really. Some English, some French, some Native American. There were amongst both the French and the British colonies people that are sometimes referred to as go-betweens. These are people, sometimes of mixed race, fur traders, people who went between, the go-betweens, between these cultures, and they were interpreters. I suppose in the Canadian experience, the Jesuit missionaries would be classic examples of people who learned native languages, obviously spoke French, so they were conduits of this culture. In British North America, missionaries were not nearly so important. And so the go-betweens were more often fur traders, farmers, settlers, explorers, guides, the kinds of men who would lead parties to the West. So go-betweens bridged between these cultures.
On May 18th, 1756, England formally declares war on France. Now, this may seem like a bit of a silly question, but North America, Professor, is a pretty big place. Why could these two imperial powers not simply share the vast amounts of land that were here?
Did you say share?
I did.
Yes. Well, this is an imperial time. And by the way, France and England, to one degree or another, have been at war since 1689, or maybe, if you prefer, since 1066. And so it's a long-running controversy. And once in a while, peace broke out at this time, but more often than not, it was some kind of war, either direct war or war through surrogates. These were negotiating positions, and indeed, in the 18th century, wars most often ended in some kind of negotiation. Seeking to destroy your enemy or totally annihilate your enemy was really quite beyond 18th century Enlightenment thinking. And by the way, they did in fact negotiate. There were negotiations going on in the early 1750s in Paris, where they were trying to settle boundary lines, always uncertain. And they were using maps in Paris or London that were quite inaccurate. And so trying to draw these lines was always controversial. And quite often it ended up in war. And so the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, is one of a series of wars between these two imperial powers over who is in fact going to rule in various parts of the world, who's going to be supreme, who will rule the world.
But I gather from reading your book that the turning point, if you like, or perhaps the most important decision made during the course of this war was made by the then British Prime Minister William Pitt, not to make defending the homeland a priority, but rather to defeat the French in North America the priority. Why did he make that decision?
Absolutely, Steve. William Pitt was a brilliant and unlikable man. He did not have many friends in Parliament. He skewered his opposition, but he was brilliant. And when Pitt became the king's first minister, he decided that the war could best be won in Canada, in North America, which made good strategic sense because warring on the continent gave the French a particular advantage. The French could always muster very large armies. In a comparison of population, France greatly outnumbered the British. And so on the continent, Pitt's decision was to use his ally, Frederick the Great, the Emperor of Prussia, a brilliant military tactician and strategist, to use Frederick the Great to tie down the French army in Europe. In the meantime, Pitt used the Royal Navy, which controlled the North Atlantic for the most part, to use the Royal Navy to protect the sea lanes to British North America, transport troops and supplies to North America to attack the French. And in the meantime, of course, using the Royal Navy to prevent the French from reinforcing North America. So Pitt saw that the cockpit of war, as they might say in the 18th century, was North America. That is where they could do it. I might also add that Pitt's largesse was famous. He decided, too, to open the doors of the Treasury. He would pay anything to win the war. And so he subsidized the colonies, sent money, sent supplies to them, trying to encourage them to support the war, to turn out their militia, and to support the army, the British Army, as it attacked, and Navy, as it attacked the French. So Pitt did things on a very grand scale. And I might point out that that grand scale, of course, would come home to roost in the period after the war, when the debts had to be paid.
And they threw him out, of course, as well. Let me...
yes, they did. They did indeed.
Yeah. Let me read an excerpt. I'm sorry, Professor, I'm going to read an excerpt from your book here on what was clearly the most important battle in this war for Canada. And that was fought in 1759 on the Plains of Abraham. And here's the quote. General Wolfe stood with his men. He ordered them to load 2 musket balls at a time and hold their fire. When the French were only 40 yards away, officers and NCOs behind the British line ordered, "Present," and then fired. Thousands of lead balls tore through the French center. Men fell in windrows. The redcoats reloaded and advanced steadily. As he advanced with the grenadiers, a musket ball slammed into Wolfe's right wrist. Wolfe wrapped the wound and pushed on. The enemy signed him again. This time, he took a ball in the stomach and another in the breast. He crumbled to the ground. While Wolfe lay dying, the battle continued to rage. Montcalm rode to the front, presenting a perfect target astride his black charger. The Marquis was hit several times. The doctor told him he would be dead by morning, to which the Marquis responded, "Good, I will not see the English in Quebec." This was a battle in which the French and the British each lost 650 dead. The French marched out of Quebec City. All these years later, 253 years later, what would you say the overarching significance of this battle was?
It's one of the epic battles in world history. Not in size or scale or number of men involved, but it's a battle that decided the fate of North America. And it's a battle that decided, indeed, the fate of the British Empire. It was decisive in a way that few battles are decisive. It also, of course, because of the extraordinary romance surrounding the death of the 2 commanders in this magnificent fashion, has lived down through history. The dying words of Montcalm, the dying words of Wolfe. They have become national heroes. National heroes, by the way, in both in Canada, certainly, and in Great Britain as well. And so over the last 200 plus years, we've come to revere them. Very brave men. I think one must admire in this kind of engagement where the commanders themselves go to the front of their lines. I think we would have fewer wars if the generals had to lead at the front of the lines.
You suggest in the book that the French Canadians of the time were not as upset as one might think about the defeat of the French and the British taking over. How come?
Well, the French, Montcalm in particular, and the French officers that came with him, really had a fair amount of disdain for the Canadians, French Canadians. They saw them as very provincial. And indeed, as I mentioned before about Voltaire, there was some question about the value of Canada at all. But once the British won, they did something rather wise. They gave generous government. They allowed the French Canadians the freedom of their religion and did not interfere with their culture, which for the 18th century was somewhat remarkable. You know, Steve, it had only been a short time before in Nova Scotia, or Acadia as it was then called, that a quite different approach had been taken. When the Acadians, the French Acadians, after the British had taken over, were rounded up and deported, sent away, the Great Expulsion as it was called. One can conceive that after the British took Canada, they might have attempted similar harsh measures against the French Canadians, but they did not. They did not do that. They gave generous government. They did not give self-government. That was not the case at all. But they did allow the French people to maintain their culture and maintain their religion. And that proved to be very wise and very valuable, because when the American Revolution came, the Americans invaded Canada. You know, revolutions always like to export themselves in the early, heady days. And we thought, of course, that if we sent an army into Canada, that the French Canadians would immediately join us and rebel against their British masters. They did not. They did not join the American cause. And one of the principal reasons for that was because under British rule, they had been fairly treated, and they really had no reason to rebel.
I have 20 seconds left, Professor, which is not enough time to ask you this, but I'm going to anyway. We're 200 years away from the War of 1812, still arguing about who won, but we know who lost. It was the native people.
Yes.
Can you say the same thing about this war, that
yes.
regardless of who won, we know who lost? It was the native people?
There's no question about that, Steve. The expulsion of the French from North America left the Native Americans in the hands of an Anglo-Saxon empire, which was hardly friendly towards them. As I mentioned earlier, this was an empire that valued settlement and occupation. This was an empire that was moving west. The very empire that was most inimical to the interests of the Native Americans was now in power. And the Native Americans, because of the expulsion of the French, would have great difficulty now. It was impossible indeed for them to use their leverage or use any kind of diplomacy to try to play one empire off against the other. It was a great day for Great Britain, great day for the empire, and a very bad day for Native Americans and First Nation peoples.
Empires at War, the 7 Years' War and the Struggle for North America, 1754 to 1763. On this Thanksgiving Day in Canada, I give thanks for this book, because that was a great read. William Fowler, thanks so much for your time tonight.
Thank you very much, Steve, and happy Thanksgiving to you as well.
Thank you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.